Hello. Okay, so hello everybody, and trying to figure out this live streaming. And hello everybody, indeed to our series, talk series, Regeneration and Discontent. It's been a bit of the pause between our talks, and we finally got back, this time online. And we began this series as an attempt to think about the city beyond the binarities of urban transformation, beyond the powerlessness of local inhabitants and of the omnipotence of real estate moguls. Although there can be no denial that the power struggle in the city is all too obvious to ignore, we want to look behind these grand narratives and look more closely and attentively into the opportunities that open up, into the different agencies that appear and also disappear. Gentrification for a very long time was championed as a process for a better urban future. However, it only sharpened the inequalities and left cities zoned and divided. Regeneration showed the potential of becoming an alternative for gentrification, but by no means it is immune to the pitfalls of capital-driven transformations. The term bears the connotations of closer and more attentive look to existing infrastructures and communities, but at the same time, it threatens to lure into deceptive participatory promises, where the participation is simulated to pay way for corporate developments. In this series, we want to think about the city with its multiple agencies, different stakeholders, and importance of art and artistic practices. Different specialities reveal complex and complicated relationship between art and the city, bearing immense potential for both creative impulses and destructive enclosures. Art is undoubtedly inseparable from the city. Understanding its impact for the urban fabric can provide important tools for shaping cities that are worth living in. And the whole pandemic situation brought yet another layer and another way to experience the sharpness of inequality and the sharpness of different urban problems. And I'm very happy today that we have Jaspar Joseph-Lester, who is a London-based artist and researcher, whose work explores the role images play in urban planning, social space, and everyday praxis. He is a head of sculpture and a reader in arts and post-urbanism at Royal Academy of Arts in London. Among other things, Joseph-Lester curated Dallas Pavilion for 55th Venice Biennial. He guided readers through architecture of wedding casinos, shared attentive and critical look at modernism and postmodernism with the help of text and images. His latest work, an edited book, Future Ruins Lisbon, and virtual walk series, took a closer look into the speculative side of urban environments where different temporalities meet. Influenced by architecture, design, urban planning, human geography, philosophy, cinema, media, spatial economic theory, Joseph-Lester explores the dissemination of competing ideologies in the practice of modern urban regeneration and social organization. Here, he seeks to show how artistic practice can diminish and transform the influences of repetitive master plans and regeneration schemes that often destroy urban cultural life. So I'm very happy to introduce Joseph-Lester, and his lecture trigger point, Can Art Prefigure Urban Life? So thank you so much for joining us, and I give word to our speaker.
Okay, I'm just going to share screen. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the talk. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak about this point, Can Art Prefigure Urban Life? What I want to do in the talk today is just map out a few key points that I've been considering for some years through projects, and give some examples of group work and discussions I've been involved with through a series of projects. So what I want to do first is just maybe talk a little bit about the title. So trigger point, Can Art Prefigure Urban Life, is a sort of two-part thing. And the first part of the title comes from a talk or at a conference at a conference that I gave in Oxford in 2016, which was called Urban Governance and Its Discontents. And of course, immediately reminded me of the title of the lecture series run by the Architecture Foundation, Architecture and Its Discontents. And here we really looked at this question of how art can refigure or prefigure the city. And you'll see in the image, I kind of wanted, it's not a great quality image, I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to put it in because you still get a sense of what it's like for people to talk face to face, but also to see the writing on the screen, which says, representing the city, can art projects refigure the challenge, and challenge urban futures. So this question of refiguring and prefiguring is really the starting point of the talk today. And through the talk, I just want to make the case for prefiguring of urban space, of city making, as opposed to what we've come to know as refiguring. And I'll be returning to those terms throughout. So again, just another picture of me here with Irit Rogoff, who's professor of visual cultures at Goldsmiths University, and the artist Mary Mattingly, who is an American-based artist involved in socially engaged projects and also interested in sustainability and environmental works. So together we were on the panel, and it was part of a larger conference in Oxford University that was organized by two urban think tanks, one called Urban Transformations and the other one called Urban Futures. And it sort of interested me because the project was very much about bringing different disciplines together to look at how we can challenge urban futures, how we can make cities better. This panel was really the panel that looked at the role of art, hence the question, and was sort of situated at the end of the conference and sort of somehow maybe unconsciously indicative of some of the problems that I'll be raising later on. So the second part of the title is trigger point. Well, it starts trigger point. It's this idea of a kind of starting point. And trigger point, I suppose, takes us back to the notion of an origin or a starting point. And again, connecting to the argument that we need to start to prefigure than as opposed to refigure trigger point becomes kind of central in terms of thinking this through. And certainly this project that I have been working on with the curator, Susanna Prince, who's director of the Rosa Luxemburg Kunstverein in Berlin, and also Julie Westerman, who's an artist based in Sheffield. This project is very much about finding platforms for generating some discussion between urban stakeholders. So that's what I want to start with in terms of just explaining the origin of the title of this talk. And I'm going to just quickly stop sharing the screen, and I'm just going to speak for a while about the key points that I want to raise. So while it might be something of a cliche to say that we need to rethink how we work together to construct better futures, the fact remains now more than ever that there is an opportunity to restructure the world around us. As part of this reconstruction, we also need to interrogate and reconsider the role of art, especially in relation to urban development and planning. It is important to do this now, as we are at a moment when the role of artists needs to be understood as a resource that is vital to the task of city making. This resource, I will argue, is vastly undervalued and often wrongly deployed. In order to rethink the role of artists and art in relation to the question of prefiguring the city, we first need to challenge the way policies are developed, cities are designed, and architecture is thought. Just as art cannot be the sole domain of artists, architecture and urban development should not be the safe house of architects and planners. While the physical manifestation of cities is important, it is, as the economist and urban theorist Saskia Sassen has pointed out, the spaces that we don't see, the invisible parts of the city that we don't perceive straight away, that need to be addressed and brought into view. This important point, that is, how we come to understand and navigate those structures and architectures that are immaterial, such as lawscapes, infrastructure space, politics, economics, overlooked histories, and marginalized livelihoods. These are the forces, the structures, the very things that determine our experience of the city, and it is these aspects that I want to focus on in this talk. I'm often asked, what value does art bring to our cities? What does it contribute? Here again, we need to open up the frame to instead ask the question, what new ways of thinking and doing do artists bring to the practice of city making? We ask this at a time when the cultural life of cities is under threat, but also when cities are undergoing radical change. So it's both a time of crisis, but also a time of opportunity. But let's return to the question in hand. What role does art play in prefiguring the city? Here again, we see that art and artists are a valuable resource. That's right, a resource that has a huge amount of value attached to it. However, we are rarely given the opportunity to prefigure, but always and instead required to refigure. That is, artists can easily find themselves in a role where they are fixing those areas of society that don't work. We just need to think about the countless projects that involve building communities where social bonds have been eradicated because of poor government policy and profit-driven urban development. We think of residencies where artists give representation through, say, documentation or ethnographic methodologies to lives that have been overlooked and undervalued by the state. There are amazing things that take place through these initiatives, but the fact remains that artists are often invited to fill the gap left by underfunded local authorities or profit-driven developments looking to draw on culture as a way to drive up the price of real estate. Now, we know this story very well. One example that springs to mind was an exhibition I was in when I was a PhD student, which was in a disused school in Whitechapel, and the developers had invited a group of artists to have an exhibition in the premises. As part of that event, my PhD supervisor, Suhail Malik, gave a talk about this process of regeneration and gentrification. And I'll never forget the way that he described the role of artists as being like stormtroopers, the notion that artists are brought in and required to bring a kind of life to a space, to give it texture and to make a place. And we know how this goes, that the story is very well documented through countless books and literature about from Soho, New York, Chelsea, to the East End of London and other cities all over the world, where artists are brought into deprived areas and given opportunities to live and work cheaply, to make the place feel safer for those then to buy into properties, and artists are then driven out because the prices rise. So this is a familiar kind of cycle. So the key argument here is proposing a move from prefiguring, the key argument here is proposing a move from refiguring, that is the task of fixing the problems of society, to prefiguring urban space, which would involve throwing out the old idea of engaging with art as a dispensable cherry on the pie of urban development. So instead, we explore how we develop new structures that enable artists to be involved in all aspects of planning and urban development. And this role is understood as being vital to the way we conceive of urban space. So the old kind of way that artists are used to kind of solve problems, but also they're there to kind of fill gaps in cities that potentially aren't working very well because of a lack of society, poor government, lack of funding. They're often invited also into larger private developments, and this is this phrase as it's kind of putting the cherry on the top of the cake, something that is dispensable and sort of thought as kind of decoration. These are the kind of examples that have not been useful for thinking about the role of art in the city. So I want for a moment just to think about or return to this idea of invisible forces. And sorry about that phrase, because it sounds like another reference to Star Wars. It's not intended like that. So just as Saskia Sasson has introduced this idea of invisible forces as being the kind of structure, the makeup, the kind of areas that really determine the city. I want to develop this idea and expand it into what I think art has to offer in terms of city development. I touched on the importance of addressing these invisible forces to consider what they might and how they might help us to be expansive within city development. Here I'm talking about the idea that these forces determine our experience of the city, and that this constitutes, I would argue, a kind of architecture, an architecture that guides us around lawscapes, and say, just as someone like Andreas Philippopoulos Miapopoulos has described very clearly in his work on spatial justice, they help us to navigate our way through the complexities of politics and economics on a daily basis. On the other hand, there's notions around entropy that are proposed by the artist Robert Smithson, which are also useful, especially when he uses the term de-architecturalization to discuss the open geometries of time and space and what he calls the memory traces of an abandoned set of futures. Now I'm going to return to these ideas of lawscapes and entropy in relation to one of the projects I've been involved with. But I just want to use those as examples of these kind of structures, these forces that determine our experience of urban space. So the ability of artists to repurpose space, such as abandoned architectures, to imagine different ways of using space, but also to engage with marginalized histories and overlooked livelihoods, is key to the work that is needed for the development of cities. If we are agreeing that the role of artists in cities is vital and a valuable resource for some of the reasons I've said, how then do we best contribute to the problems at hand? The way that art can contribute is through the role of artists rather than through art as such. If we are to argue, such as just as Saskia Sassen has done in recent years, that the city exists on the edge of our peripheral vision, then we might equally say that the resource of artists is not so much what is produced, but how it is produced. That it is here that we want to explore the how, and maybe not so much the stuff of the what. Well, of course, that's important too, but for the sake of this argument, I want to focus on the how. When we begin to bring the how of what we do as artists into the light, when these processes and activities that enable art to happen are made visible, we can more easily understand what the production of art involves and how it also contributes to new ways of thinking. The question then is how best to deploy this valuable resource of art and artists. The relevance and value of artists within the context of city making is firstly to think critically, to challenge the status quo, and to help develop new approaches that are expansive. Just like in government, where we demand a strong opposition to challenge policy, we need artists in roles where they can challenge policy, planning, and design, and contribute to those discussions at the earliest possible stage. Okay, so I just wanted to get those ideas out there, first of all, before returning back to my presentation. And I'm just going to go back to shared screen. Bear with me a second. Okay, here we are. So this is the book that I chose for the talk. I was invited to propose a book. This book is the kind of endpoint of the Trigger Point Lisbon project, and it's called Future Ruins Lisbon. It does involve a number of essays and city guides that I'll be describing through this lecture. So this notion of a city guide was a kind of platform, I suppose, for really thinking about enabling discussion between urban stakeholders. And the title here is the Lisbon Atlas of Law and Entropy. And as part of this project, which was alongside a number of other city guides developed between artists and experts from different disciplines, this map, this city guide, was really to do with thinking about capturing a moment in time. But it was also conceived around an idea of a kind of game, if you like. So I invited a group of 7 people, all kind of coming from different areas and disciplines. And the project was really to think about walking the city over this period of time between 1:30 and 3:30 in the afternoon on Sunday, the 30th of October, 2016. And this slice of time afforded perspectives and insights to reveal a city's subject to the structures and forces only experienced in the moment. So the plan was, or the structure involved a series of text messages or WhatsApp messages going back to the gallery that we were working with in Lisbon, Hangar. And these were responses to this very idea of entropy and law. I'd asked each of the participants to consider entropy and law as they were walking around the city and send their messages or observations to the gallery. And then these were transcribed with the time of the message onto the back of the guide. Other guides involved the waterways of Lisbon. So this was a project that took place between the artist Miguel Santos and the professor of physical geography at Durham University, Jonathan Wainwright. And together they wanted to look at both the kind of fictional life of Lisbon's waterways through culture, but also the kind of physical geography of its past and its relationship to the river. And I think this one was important. I mean, there are 6 guides, and I wanted to pick this one out because it helps also to explain the role of culture within thinking about the city. So this very notion of waterways and the city of Lisbon in its relationship to the kind of flow and time is key to the kind of fictional narratives and representations that adorn the city. And it was precisely that Miguel Santos, the artist, tried to capture alongside kind of more factual, historical guide that Jonathan Wainwright went about developing. So this guide also involved a drawing, and in fact the drawing is by the physical geographer Jonathan Wainwright, and it maps out the waterways of Lisbon. Just sticking with Lisbon for a moment, this is the panoramic or panoramico, which was the focus of another guide developed by the artist Ian Keir and Marta Jenku, who together wanted to really develop an idea of a guide to this kind of ruin. But this particular building, this particular ruin is of special significance. And we went to visit this building as a site. And I want to use this example because it also allows me to kind of revisit what I was talking about in the notes earlier, which is to do with the role of artists in repurposing abandoned architectures. And I think the guide, in a way, the city guide that, like I say, focuses on this building, the Panoramico, offers a different approach to thinking about abandoned architectures. It's an intervention, but it's an intervention that doesn't actually change the space. So this building looks over Lisbon. It was built in 1968 at the time of the dictatorship, and then closed in 2001, and since has kind of fell into ruin. It sits in the middle of a kind of city park called Monsanto City Park, right in the center of Lisbon. And like I say, looks out over the city with these kind of panoramic views. Moving towards the interior of the building, the park is sort of joined with the architecture of the space. And inside the space, you see this kind of elegant staircase that takes you up to the first floor. And even with that movement up the stairs, you see the city of Lisbon below, kind of framed through these window frames. As you move to the first floor, where there would have been the kind of main area of the restaurant, you get more of these kind of blown out windows, other views, other panoramic views of the city. But also you begin to see the kind of interventions of the groups that have entered into this building. the sort of graffiti, but also kind of objects that adorn the space, that make this building something of a kind of what you might call a living artwork. This is the first floor again, and you see this kind of viewing station, which was a walkway used again to experience this idea of the panoramic, the panoramico, this 360 sort of view, moving view of the city, much like the much earlier panoramic paintings. But here, this is a real view of the city in a kind of cinematic fashion. The building is a kind of viewing machine that allows for the city to be viewed, like I say, like a kind of surveillance over the city, somehow removed, but also connected up on this hill. But it also is a generator of images itself. On the next floor, on the second floor, there are these inscribed plans of buildings that are graffitied over. You can't really see it in this image, I'm afraid. I'm sorry about that, but it's an all-around view of the city as you move around this second floor of the building. And the graffiti again is overlaid over these drawings, or drawings, inscriptions of buildings, some that no longer exist. So there's this sort of interaction of these kind of interventions, the disappearance of spaces from the city, and the representation of those objects or landmarks that still exist. You can just about see the aqueduct in the right-hand corner of the building, just outside of the right-hand corner of the screen. So the building is a sort of meeting place, a place where people come to hang out and meet, but also to photograph the city. It's a space that has just been left alone, a space that offers a sort of counter architecture, what you might call a shift from architecture to site. A monument that seems to be continually changing. And of course, there are issues around health and safety and all of that. But just for the moment, let's consider this as a kind of picturesque ruin that serves a kind of function. Making our way onto the roof, again, you can see the extent of the views from this building. This would not be something that would have normally been available, but in its present state, you can climb onto the roof. And there's even, if you look closely under the water, there seems to be a kind of Keith Haring drawing in this sort of infinity pool prototype that is the roof of the Panoramico. So just returning to the guide that was developed as part of this project, Trigger Point, Lisbon. Here, the back of the guide, which folds into smaller sections, shows the Panoramico in its kind of at its design stage, before it was built, but then also in its state of operating as a restaurant. The guides together, I just wanted to show you this. I'm not going to talk about this for too long, but were shown as part of an exhibition at the National Museum of History and Science in Lisbon. There's 6 guides altogether, and here we're able to show them on light boxes and tables, but also in relation to a collaborative film. The guides then were also shown at the Gulbenkian Foundation. But here we were able to show them alongside other city guides, historical city guides that were selected by the librarian and archivist Anna Borata. I'm just going to have a quick drink. So this was a chance to really put our guides in the context of the kind of historical, traditional, touristic guide. And for us, this was also a chance to have a kind of broader discussion about what it might mean to kind of almost subvert this form, develop this form, but at the same time use what is essentially a kind of touristic trope as a sort of kind of critical tool, but a platform too for discussion between what I'm calling stakeholders, city stakeholders. And I say this because from my experience, part of the problem of interdisciplinary research, the problem of how artists work with other disciplines has mostly been around the kind of structures and frameworks that don't allow for it to happen. There aren't sophisticated structures and frameworks that really allow people to speak to one another easily in a way that's generative. So the city guide, I suppose, was a way of just speculating on how that might happen. It did involve quite a precise framework in that we developed this notion of host and guest, and the host was always a resident from the city, and the guest was not just from another discipline, but from another place. And the idea being that the perspective of the host was challenged by the guest, and the guest was challenged by the host. And this kind of created a sort of debate across spaces, but also across disciplines. So the process of the city guide was, and this platform for discussion was then developed in Berlin with another series of 6 projects. Again, working with Susanna Prince and Julie Westerman to invite a number of participants who would allow us to kind of take this concept a bit further, but this time in relation to Berlin. So for my part, I wanted to really develop an older project from 2000 and I think it was 2010 or 11. And this was a project where I was invited to contribute to this collapse journal, which was called Casino Real. And I proposed this guide to the casino architecture of Wedding. And Wedding is, as many of you I'm sure know, is an area in Berlin, a kind of primarily a kind of Turkish area in Berlin, next to Mitte, but also a space where a lot of artists are living and a lot of small galleries and projects take place. In my time in Wedding, I'd noticed these small-scale casinos, and one of the things that struck me was how they'd become invisible. They were kind of ubiquitous. They were everywhere in the area, but no one really talked about them. It's as if no one really noticed them. So this original guide was, like I say, in book form, and it really looked at the kind of vernacular of the Wedding casino architecture. So here I compare corner casinos with one another, and in the guide I talk about the reason why the vendors might want a corner casino as opposed to a first floor casino, a residential casino, or a main street casino. This was these JFC casinos were what I would talk about as being a slightly upmarket casino, and again just talking about the vernacular, giving some focus again to those areas of the city, those areas of this space of Wedding that were not discussed or looked at. Following from 2011, I returned then with this project Trigger Point in 2018 to go back to the same casino spaces. And here you see on the left is the casino shot in Wedding in 2011, and on the right it's the same space in 2018. So this period of 7 years was important for me to kind of research, because I quickly saw that these spaces weren't changing. And again, this kind of idea of an overlooked architecture, a space of stasis, was ignored. And I wanted to give it some focus through these guides, as opposed to those areas of kind of rapid transformation that are often represented and discussed. So one of the things I wanted to do was find ways of thinking about what these spaces might become in the future. So I worked with the futurologist Ludwig Engel, who's based in Berlin, and he became the kind of host of this city guide. And between us, we discussed who we might invite to predict what would become of these spaces in 2025. And to do that, we came up with this idea of using these images, both from 2011 and 2018, and sending them out to various participants who would then write a narrative, which would be, or a kind of fictional narrative, or a scenario, or describe a scenario that would be a kind of form of representation of what these spaces would become in the future. So here there is a story by the professor of political aesthetics, Esther Leslie, and another narrative by Andreas Philippopoulos, who I mentioned earlier, and the classicist Ahuvia Kahane, all looking at this future life of these casinos. Also, local residents were involved, and like I say, Ludwig Engel, who is based in Berlin, produced a text for this guide. And the end result is a city guide that focuses on the past, present, and future of the casino architecture of Wedding. Okay. I have to say, it's quite strange not being able to see anyone, and just I feel like I'm speaking to myself a bit, but so I'm just going to have a drink for a moment. So the next project I want to talk about, and again, this touches on the idea of repurposing architecture and artist's role, what the role of the artist is in city making. This project, Tegel's Speculations and Propositions, ran between 2012 and 14, and again was developed in partnership with Susanna Prince and Julie Westerman. It started out as a program of short artist videos made in response to the imminent closure of Tegel Airport, Berlin. The program was shown at the Babylon Cinema in June 2012 as titled Tegel Flights of Fancy. Now, the idea of doing this was to mark the closure that was planned for the airport in 2012, in 2nd of June, I think it was. And we'd planned this screening of videos that not just celebrated the airport, which is kind of in some ways sort of iconic in its architecture, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but also speculated on its future use. And this is important because video became, through this project, a way of imagining the kind of repurposing, the reuse of this airport that was going to be taken out of service, but in fact still running. Anyway, that's another story. Following the project with video works, we invited 12 writers to also develop stories around thinking about the future of Tegel airport. And together, this became publication and a DVD, which is part of the publication, that I would say really kind of constitutes an idea of what it means to kind of plan or speculate on the future use of parts of the city. This, like I say, this started out as a series of videos, often in collaboration, collaborations between artists, and then we branched out to writers as well. But as part of the publication, we also wanted to interview the architect. This is one of von Gerken's drawings for Tegel, and you can see this hexagonal space of the main terminal, which in many respects is a kind of very human space, as opposed to a space just to move people through like cattle. So the kind of dimensions of it mean that it wasn't actually so useful for airlines who needed to get people to pass through this airport more quickly. And that was one of the reasons why it was being closed. It also had quite a short runway. So we went to visit the architect von Gerken, who was responsible for designing Tegel Airport and also responsible for developing some of the plans for its use in the future. And one of the things that he developed was this idea of the airport becoming a center for sustainability, which is kind of quite interesting in a way. But while we were interviewing him for the publication, he also wanted to show us the other work he was doing. And through the offices, we went from room to room looking at commissions that he was developing for building new cities in China. And these cities in China were in some ways a kind of larger version of what this airport looks like. They were kind of, rather than hexagons, they were circles and circles moving outwards. And we sort of got onto the discussion or conversation about the role of art in cities. And he made it quite clear that there was very little need for artists in cities because architects could do that job. And in some ways, perhaps he may have had a point in the sense that public work, he's obviously thinking about public artworks and public commissions, that he thought he could kind of develop instead. And one of the commissions or public works that his architecture office produced was a kind of cloud maker that developed this sort of mist in the sky over the city in China. This is a still from the video that I made for the project, and it basically was a collaboration with a filmmaker who was experienced with special effects, and we developed different scenarios around the building where it sort of disappeared and blew up. And this sort of disappearance of the building got me thinking, again, just going back to this idea of the panoramico, of the importance maybe of actually leaving some buildings to decay, to become ruins, just as the panoramico offers a space, perhaps, of kind of meeting, but also a space of kind of communal activity, a sort of living artwork, as I put it. So too, I could imagine Tegel performing in this way. But thinking about it again today, I just had a look on the internet, and the plan is for Tegel to become an urban tech republic. And here you can see the whole area, which is to be developed into this industrial park for urban technology. So, the Dallas Pavilion, 2010 to 2019. Again, quite an invested project, a long period of time to be working on a single project, but it started out as a commission and developed into a strong collaboration with the artist Michael Corris, who is known for his work with art and language, but also for developing this idea of the free museum and thinking really about this question about the role of art in the city. So together, we wanted to put together this idea, this concept of the Dallas Pavilion. And the Dallas Pavilion would be a representation of the city of Dallas, presented at the Venice Biennale in 2013. And this was the challenge. So I spent quite a lot of time in Dallas working with Michael, but also working with the group of participants in the project to conceive of a way of thinking about how Dallas would be represented in the Biennale. So let us propose a pavilion that can contain a cross-section of art worlds, a space where the city is experienced through the material spaces and conceptual structures that shape our understanding of what art can be. This project was also presented as part of a journal, which is online. You can see here the Open University 2013, and you can download the Dallas Pavilion there. It was, in many respects, a kind of celebration of the multiplicity of art worlds in the city of Dallas, a way of countering the idea or the kind of image of a city, such as Dallas, as being sort of right-wing, redneck, and uninterested in culture. But more than that, it was a way of trying to bring together art worlds that would not normally speak to one another, to think about grassroots kind of projects with that may or may not do community work, but support artists with residencies and studio spaces, to larger scale collections, museums, and other spaces. And the challenge was then to invite suggestions for the art spaces of Dallas. And we went with around 23 art spaces in Dallas. And I'm going to show you a few of them because it helps to illustrate this argument, or this idea, sorry, of how a city can be represented through its kind of cultural life. So the first submission was a room in the pavilion that would be dedicated to this art space, the skyscape that is in the Nasher collection in the city of Dallas downtown. But the point of it is that it was declared destroyed when a skyscraper was built and covered over what was a kind of sky viewing space. The other submission that we wanted to include was this football stadium, the Cowboys football stadium, because it was home to a number of commissioned artworks by the likes of Doug Aitken, Franz Ackermann, Lawrence Weiner, Mel Buckner, Daniel Buren, and Eva Rothschild, just to name a few. And it's kind of difficult to imagine how artists such as this could exist in a football stadium in any other country, in fact, in any other city. But here in Dallas, they combine these worlds quite successfully. Also in the shopping center, you find artworks from the Nasher collection set against shops such as Gucci. And one other example was a kind of more of an archival example, going back to Robert Smithson and his plans for the development of the airport in Dallas, in Fort Worth Airport. And when they were developing the airport, they actually invited Robert Smithson to be the resident artist, working with the architects, alongside the architects during their development of plans for the airport and runways. And one of the plans that they submitted, in fact, and it's kind of difficult to imagine now, were these kind of earthworks that would run alongside the airport and be seen as passengers took off and landed from Dallas Fort Worth. Sadly, it was never realized because the architecture practice that competed for this work, this commission, were never invited to do that. I think another larger company won it. So there are a number of examples like this, but the point being is that in each and every case, they challenged an image or representation of the city to show how art spaces, art worlds, and artists construct a kind of fabric that actually makes a city a kind of almost an alternative image of cities too. However, we returned in 2019 to again take part in the Venice Biennale, and this was with 24 participants, and these were artists, historians, and community activists. And rather than being a celebration of the kind of cultural life of the city, the Dallas Pavilion 219 was much more of a kind of critique of how the city had failed to bring these communities together and solve some of the endemic problems that we're kind of witnessing happening all over America. So it was almost like a sort of negation of the first 2013 Dallas Pavilion, but here we used these broadsheets as proposals to suggest initiatives and developments that the city of Dallas could potentially benefit from, but has failed to implement. So it was a kind of critique of the city. These broadsheets were shown in the Giardini, but also in kind of poster form around the city. So public notice. I want to talk about this because, again, it's a sort of trope of the city and something that I've been interested in terms of how we appropriate this idea of a public notice that in many respects is overlooked and under-analyzed. And I think it was a starting point for me conceiving of a work for this outdoor exhibition. And here I had the opportunity, so I'll just show you, to use this notice board. And for that notice board, I developed this fictional letter, which was from a large company called Transheritage. And they informed the residents of Mecklenburg Square, which is quite a nice sort of Georgian square in Holborn. They inform the residents, or the letter informs the residents, that the square is about to be removed piece by piece and sent to the new smart city in South Korea, New Songdo. This actually led to a series of fictional letters that were responses and turned up on the notice board. One from Camden Council here that tell Transheritage that they will have to pay a fair amount of tax for removing these buildings brick by brick, and also the park that the notice is sitting in. So this work, public notice, is very much developed through the activity of city walking. And city walking, I suppose, or city walks, connects much of the work I've been talking about. We just need to think about this very notion of a city guide to realized that it's directly connected to the idea of the city walk. So Walking Cities London is a book that is edited by myself and Amy Blair Caruthas from the Royal Academy of Music and Simon King from the RCA, and also Roberto Boltanzi, who is an architect based at the Bartlett. Through the book Walking Cities, we really wanted to explore how walking connects disciplines. So architecture, music, philosophy, social sciences were all represented through individuals that understand walking to be a kind of key part of how they develop their research, their practice, their thinking. And this book sort of traces these walks through the streets of London, and often in the form of how we separate it is in the form of night walks, or walks that respond to kind of alternative monuments, writing in cities, and also this very notion of music and sight. So through this period of lockdown, we've moved online, and this involves work with what are called the Walkative Society at the Royal College of Art. That's where I'm working. It's actually the Royal College of Art, and the Walkative Society is made up of a student body, but also myself and Simon King, that developed this idea through a series of collaborative projects. And like I say, over this period of lockdown, we've moved to online walks, traveling from starting in Berlin, you can see here with Antonia Lowe, and moving to Stockholm with Anna Adal, and then Cape Town with Robin Kirsten, and so on and so on. So in each case, again, a little bit like the guides, the walk is hosted and mostly led by artists. And it's an insight into, I suppose, especially at this time, what's happening in cities in lockdown. But it's also a chance and an opportunity to experiment with how we really consider walking now, and how walking, our experience of cities and walking in cities has changed, and what that opens up and what it means for the future. So the last project I want to talk about is Marketing Suite. And again, this was a project developed with a group of students. And here again, I want to really consider this image of the Marketing Suite as a space much like, but very different to, the Wedding casinos, a space that is ubiquitous through capital cities, but somehow overlooked or invisible. It is somehow invisible because it's not necessary, I suppose, for people to really engage with it, much like the casino. However, it's very much part of our experience of the city. And increasingly, the spaces that are developed as marketing suites compete with one another to be novel and interesting in an architectural form, to house what is otherwise a sort of simulation of what's to come, the kind of suite that is on view and also for sale. So we wanted to use this as our starting point for an exhibition that took place, first of all, at Philae. And the group made works that were a development of their individual practices, but also in response to this very notion of a marketing suite. And we put them together to form really our own marketing suite. And here you can see, and then it went on to another space at Assembly Point. And you can see here Archie's work, which is this cutout of a concierge or sales rep who's on wheels and motorized, and moves towards you, and then turns her back on you as she looks out for somebody else to try and sell property to. But one of the key parts of the project was also appropriating the brochure, the marketing brochure that we find in marketing suites. So here we worked with the designer's work form to really think about what it might mean to create a sort of montage of marketing suites, and also represent some aspect of the exhibitions that have taken place as part of the project. So these are all the participants in the project, not all students. Some also were invited in to share research around this very idea of the marketing suite. You can see Archie Lee Jones then, page 4, he is responsible for the concierge on wheels. But one of the things that really came across was this use of language, of course, that we find in marketing suites, which is kind of in a way aligned to an idea of kind of architecture too. And so we appropriated these phrases through the brochure, such as this one, rich history or places to entertain, and showed works by each of the participants in relation to these phrases. Don't do ordinary, and also images from other marketing suites. The site boasts outstanding details and a fantastic use of space. So I want to finish there because there may be a chance to talk with somebody out there. It's very, like I said, it's a very odd experience, not being able to see anyone. And I just want to make sure that there is time for us to potentially answer any questions. Before I do that, I just also would like to return to a few of the key points just to wrap up. So the key points that I've been making through this talk, and hopefully are demonstrated through some of the examples of works that I've been discussing, is this move that I'm arguing for from refiguring to prefiguring. So more often than not, our artists are invited to refigure, to solve the problems of kind of poor management, poor governance, and underfunding in cities. But there seems to be a hole in terms of, or a space in terms of the structures that could exist for artists to actually be involved at a much earlier stage, because I'm arguing that they involve or could contribute a vital resource. It's a vital resource that is not necessarily being taken advantage of. And that resource is to do with what I'm calling critical thinking. That critical thinking is far more effective within a structure of opposition than as we often see outside of that structure. And I make the comparison with government, where an active government, a successful government needs a very strong opposition. And as far as I can tell at the moment, there's very little opposition to the way that cities are developed and made. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for Jaspar Joseph-Lester for the lecture. And indeed, it's interesting and inspiring to think about what would happen if artists and artistic practices are called not upon fix something, but to develop together with and to think about this creative process as part of urban developments. And using my position now, I would like just to ask, go back a little bit to Lisbon and ask about, you mentioned a process that got my attention, that is when some object goes from architecture to site. And could you elaborate a bit on that? How does this work, and what does it brings for inhabitants and for the users of the space?
Okay, yeah, well, this movement from architecture to site, and I was talking about that in relation to the Panoramico, is really about, I suppose, what happens when there is an architecture that in many respects is able to form itself. That's kind of actually what Robert Smithson calls a sort of kind of de-architecturalization. This mode of sort of ruin, let's call it, is, as I've been talking about, also a kind of entropy, where there is a sort of reversal of the ruin at one point, decaying, but at the other point, kind of, or other moment, growing and developing and expanding. And that's precisely, I suppose, what I mean about this shift from architecture, the domain of architects and planners, to site, the domain of the inhabitants of a city, I suppose.
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much. I guess that
I mean, I can give a bit more background to these ideas, and it's it also, I suppose, comes it refers to the, let's say, going back to the 60s with Venturi and this idea of learning from Las Vegas, this idea that even casino architecture with its, and this is the other kind of extreme, but in a way crosses over with this idea of an architecture that invents itself. Casino architecture, which is at the mercy of the market, reinvents itself continuously. And rather than imposing a sort of God's eye view or plan of these spaces, there is a way in which it could be interesting, and certainly interesting reading through the manifesto, Learning from Las Vegas, to learn from these developments that are a kind of non-design and non-architecture.
Yes, and maybe another, maybe last question would be, you mentioned that it's to look at the importance, not only or not what is being made by the artist, but how it is being made. And I'm very curious about this. Does you feel that it relieves certain tensions that often arises when artists are invited to participate at like urban planning or urban developments, or does it allow those tensions to grow? Like how this process works?
So this is a really good question, and important probably to return to this point, because it's a key point. The move from focusing on a kind of material output to thinking about the kind of immaterial practices, the methods or approaches. Not only that, but the way that these very methods or methodologies developed by artists are indicative of often quite a different way of thinking about, say, cities. So understanding this and giving form to it, and somehow representing how artists live and work and think is important to the development and making of cities, and shifts the focus from this idea of producing work. Now, not that there's any problem or difficulty with just producing work, but I'm trying to add a different dimension and another role that would allow for an engagement at a much earlier point in, say, a kind of planning process that's key. And in order for that to happen, I think there probably needs to be a shift from output to method. And if we begin to think about the how rather than the what, things start to become quite interesting and exciting. Just to reiterate this point, that the kind of refiguring of the city by artists is, again, not necessarily a problem. And of course, like I said earlier, there are some amazing examples of socially engaged projects. But the fact remains that these projects are there often to plug the gaps, to resolve problems that really aren't invented by communities or artists. They're problems that need to be sorted out by better government. And the issue is often that, through, and when, there's various ways we can think about public commissions. We're not talking about public commissions here. We're talking about residencies and commissions that involve community building. So often artists are required to work with community leaders to develop or help develop a kind of sense of community that's been erased by poor planning or bad government. And these projects, while they are sometimes very successful, are mostly underfunded and not sustainable. And we've seen this in great detail in previous lectures that you have online. So the issue there then is shifting the focus and opening the frame and allowing artists a slightly different role, in fact, a very different role in terms of city making, where they can really kind of contribute the kind of resource that is there but not really tapped into fully.
Okay, thank you very much. I see Will Jennings asks if we could get links of some of these projects, like online walks and others. And yeah. I know that the walks are on your YouTube channel.
Yeah. There is a YouTube channel. How we get the it's called Cities in Lockdown. It's called Walkative Cities in Lockdown, and you can find. The other way is that I have. There's a couple of Instagram sites that give the link. So the Walkative Instagram site documents all the walks. And I have a link to the channel on my Instagram site as well. But yes, I can't forward the link. You have the links to these channels, don't you?
Yes, we can share after the lecture in the comment section of our stream.
We have, just to say, I'm not trying to promote it, but we do have a city walk coming up in Los Angeles with Norman Klein, who is professor at CalArts and is a professor of kind of media and also urban studies.
All right, just we have a few thank yous from our viewers, and I think that will be all for this evening. Thank you so much. It was really inspiring and hopeful lecture. And thank you, Jaspar, for being with us tonight, and everybody who watched.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.